At the Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
First, do no harm. We all take the oath, but what does it mean to honor that oath in a time of war? I'm Emily Silverman, and this is The Nocturnist, stories from the world of medicine. In this episode, retired trauma surgeon Bill Meffert reflects on the time he spent caring for wounded soldiers in Vietnam alongside a priest. This story is graphic, so if you have children listening, I recommend you save it for later, although I hope you'll listen when you can. In the conversation afterward, Bill and I talk about practicing medicine in the middle of a war and what it's like to transition back to civilian life. Have a listen to Bill Meffert.
I'm 82 years old now, but I was only 28 when I finished my surgical training. After the surgical training, I entered the Army and was sent almost immediately to Da Nang, Vietnam, and worked in a large evacuation hospital there. This is what I remember. It's August. It's hot as hell. I took off my regular Army uniform and just wore shorts, t-shirts, and sandals, blood-stained from soldiers and sweat-soaked. I drank water from a canteen while medics scooped blood from the floors with snow shovels. I spit sand into a sink and smelled the odors of rot and antiseptics. Helicopters landed nearby, blowing sand everywhere and kerosene fumes, and the soldiers streamed in from the helicopters and went to surgery. Medics ran back and forth with blood supplies and bandages, and it was very chaotic. I hadn't dreamed that it would be like this. Well, then all of a sudden, there was nothing to do. The casualties were evacuated, and the fighting seemed to let up for whatever reason. And we slept, ate regular meals, and played volleyball. And one of my friends, Lou Cusinata, an ENT surgeon, leaped up for the ball and came down on a rock and broke his foot. He was evacuated to Honolulu. We all wanted to break a foot. Well, then all of a sudden, chaos resumed. The helicopters came in, one after the other. Sand blew through the flimsy tents. Kerosene odors were everywhere. Patients were rushed to surgery, and it all started over again. I was with two other surgeons. We took the worst patient to surgery first, and he had a brain injury and was bleeding in the abdomen and a traumatic amputation of one of his legs. We worked for several hours, and he kept bleeding, up to at least 20 units of blood, as I recall. And finally, his temperature dropped down to the point where he would not clot, and he suffered a cardiac arrest and could not be resuscitated. I was so depressed and upset and exhausted. I was dehydrated. I picked up a canteen of water, and it felt heavy as lead. Why had I ever chosen surgery? It was the last thing I would choose right then. And I thought of the patient's family, especially his mother, probably praying for him right now for a safe return. They removed him from the table, and he was replaced by a curly-head kid from Iowa with an abdominal wound and several fractures in his legs. I made the incision in the abdomen, and blood spilled out, splashing all of us before pooling on the floor. I looked in the abdomen. I could see that the right lobe of the liver was devitalized, being a dark gray instead of a normal pink. It had stellate fractures, and obviously could not be repaired. I resected that part of the liver, and the bleeding was stopped. I can't remember the number of patients or their names that I operated on. There are just too many. But Father Perez remembered. He's a Catholic priest. He was always there in the hospital, even when rockets hit nearby. He would be there wearing his sweaty fatigues with a bottle of tequila in one pocket and a bottle of holy water in the other. His only sacrament was a narrow green stole which he wore looped over his shoulders, and then he would throw it back when he bent down to talk to the soldiers. He took down their names. He asked about their relatives. He prayed with them, and he offered last rites. He believed in the soul and in life after death. I wasn't sure at that point what I believed. One night, a truck drove up to the hospital, and I went down to meet it, and Perez was already there. And we threw back the canvas cover, and there was a mound of children bound together with blood, not moving, not crying, not shouting for help. Perez and I separated the living from the dead. I saw one boy who had lost both legs and one arm. He was crying, but otherwise quiet. This was after the rocket had hit the orphanage, and I knew he had no parents left and no family. I thought, why should we save him? He would have a miserable life. He would die over a long period of time, as a beggar perhaps. But Perez saw him. He said, he's alive. He has a soul. We must save him. I said, what for? And Perez said, he's alive. He has a soul. And then he was quiet. Well, damn Perez and his religious beliefs. I took him to surgery, and he somehow survived. I stopped back several days after the surgery, and he was being propped up with stuffed toys against the back of the bed, taken care of very well with nurses, and he smiled at me. I was depressed. You know, when you're in medical school, you take the Hippocratic Oath, and one part of it says, first do no harm. I held my hand up at that time. It was so easy because we didn't face any problems. But what do you do when all the possibilities of treatment are bad, sometimes catastrophic? There's no one else who understands the situation better than you. And there's no one to give you advice. You are all alone. I remember that night when the boy came in. There's a time when the soldiers yell for help or scream for help, and then they become quiet as death approaches. That night, the boy just cried. And I don't know whether he couldn't find the words or didn't know what to say. But that night, I would have much rather been Father Perez.
I am sitting here with Bill Meffert. Hi, Bill. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for asking me.
Bill, before we start, do you just want to tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what your work has been over the last couple decades and maybe what you're doing now?
Well, I trained as a cardiovascular surgeon, and I practiced that surgery for 30 years.
Well, I'm so glad that you were able to come here to speak with us about the story that you told. I am just so curious about how you got to Vietnam. Can you tell us a little bit about the process? How did you get over there?
Yale had a competitive program for residency. It was 6 years long, and it was a big disadvantage not to be able to guarantee that you could continue. And so we all volunteered to enter the Army. So if we were chosen, then we would not be pulled out of our training, and we'd go in the Army, but we'd be fully trained. I think all of us thought it'll be over by the time we get through our training and we won't have to go in.
Before, you're about to get on a plane to Vietnam. Are you scared? Are you excited? How did you feel?
Well, I was both scared and excited. I think anybody going into a combat situation is scared. I mean, it's natural not to want to be killed. But the biggest thing that concerned me was the unknown. I mean, how could you protect yourself? And how would your training, which it included some trauma, but not very much. And I looked around the airplane, and I think there were about 120 soldiers on board, all of them 18 to 21 maybe. And I was the only older person. I was 29 years old, fully trained. And I realized I was responsible for those kids.
Maybe could you paint the scene for us a little bit? So you get on this plane, you're 29 years old, and then where is this place where you're stationed? What does it look like, and how is it set up?
Well, I'll tell you some things that maybe I shouldn't. But we took off about midnight, and we landed in Honolulu for fuel. And that's the first place we met people coming back from Vietnam. And they were delirious, shouting, yelling, drinking, and telling us to keep our heads down and shoot anything that moves. And it was pretty traumatic. And then as we flew over the South China Sea, you could see the sun coming up behind the plane, and it lit the green of Vietnam when we got there. It was so green. It was a beautiful color of green. And we were all taken to the barracks. There was a sergeant who looked like he'd spent days, weeks, months in the sun. And he shook our hands and he said, "Welcome to Vietnam. This will be something you'll be proud of and you can tell your grandchildren about." And I thought that I just was more interested in surviving the year rather than telling my grandchildren. So that was kind of a shock. And then the next day, we flew out on the C-130, a 4-engine turboprop plane. Then the next day we got our orders. I got an order for the 95th Evacuation Hospital in Da Nang, up near the DMZ, where there's lots of action.
And this was a hospital?
It was a 95th Evacuation Hospital. It had about 350, 400 beds. It was large. It had 6 operating rooms.
How many surgeons were there?
We had 36 doctors. I was the only one in charge of severe bleeding and chest wounds. I saw several heart injuries from explosions, accompanying other injuries, which were quite interesting. And I think the thing I really enjoyed about Vietnam, well, there were several things. I enjoyed being able to save as many as I could of these young kids, these innocent kids. But the other thing I enjoyed was thinking on your feet fast, because what killed these people was blood loss. And you had unusual situations that you'd never seen before. And you'd have to think, well, how can I get out of this? How do I stop the bleeding? And if you couldn't think fast, you'd lose the patient.
Where did the blood come from?
Well, I'll describe one patient. This was near the end of my tour. He came in, he had fractured legs, he had a swollen abdomen, and his blood pressure was about 40. And I think his head was okay. His chest looked okay. But he had a pressure of 40, and we took him right to the operating room, started transfusing, opened the abdomen, blood spilled out over his abdomen, all over us, all over the floor. We always had blood splashed everywhere. Our hands, we wore sandals, so our toes would get stuck with blood clots to the sandals. We didn't really think about blood exposure then, but we were soaked in blood every day. So I evacuated that. I saw 3 or 4 holes in the stomach, which were okay. I mean, you could easily manage those by cutting out part of the stomach and closing it. And some holes in the small bowel, and some holes in the right side of the colon, which managed at first just by taking that part of the colon out. But then the anesthesiologist said, well, his pressure's 60, but I can't get it any higher than that. And normally in the States, you know what you're going after because you'd have time to get CTs, MRIs, or whatever you needed. But in Vietnam, we found out by looking.
Just going in and opening the door and looking.
Well, we didn't have those studies
imaging
available. And if you took the time to do anything, any x-rays even, the patient would die. So I looked again and I saw a little hole in the diaphragm, and I noticed that each time the patient's lungs were filled with air, that some blood would spurt through that hole. And I opened up the diaphragm, and I saw a hole in the pericardium. And each heartbeat, a little spurt of blood came out of the hole in the pericardium. And so I opened the pericardium. It was rather slender.
And the pericardium, just for our listeners who don't know,
it's a sac around the heart.
It's like almost like a paper sac around the heart, like a thin.
Similar, yeah. It's a very thin, flexible tissue that surrounds the heart and keeps it in place. And there was a hole, and the blood was spurting from the heart through the hole. Well, I enlarged the hole, and I could look in, and I could see that with each heartbeat there was a stream of blood coming out of the left ventricle. And I looked a little more closely, got a little better exposure, and I could see there were 2 holes in the left ventricle. And it was kind of difficult to figure out a way of closing those holes that were right against the artery without shutting the artery off and causing a myocardial infarction or heart attack. But eventually, I used some sutures that were pledgeted to pull the heart together underneath the coronary artery, and got it got the bleeding points wedged together, and the bleeding stopped. And I looked at it for a while. It didn't start. It looked pretty good. And his pressure came up over 100. So I figured we had all the major bleeding points covered pretty well. And he woke up and he wanted a drink of water.
I'm struck by your memory of this particular case. You remember where every single injury and every hole. And I'm also struck by how you talk about this as an exercise in problem solving and really quick problem solving. And I imagine largely what draws surgeons to the field of surgery is this problem solving, very three-dimensional, kind of tactile, almost mechanical task. Does that resonate with you? Is that part of what drew you to surgery?
You don't always, in surgery, you have to guess what untreated wound will kill the patient first. And sometimes you're wrong. And you go after the wrong injury and the patient dies. And I was oftentimes faced with profound fatigue. Sweat was dripping off your face and running down your glasses, the frames, and dripping into the wounds. And you were dehydrated. Some of these cases were several hours long, the ones that were more complicated. And you'd see that dripping down, and you realize your time's running out, the pressure's still low. And sometimes they would fibrillate. They'd get hypothermic from massive transfusions, and they got hypothermic, their temperature went down, the blood wouldn't clot, and they'd die. And you lost the game. maybe it wasn't winnable. That's the problem. You're depressed because you think you did not save that patient. But you have to remember that sometimes you can't save them. Mm-hmm. You have to be mature enough to be honest with yourself, not only that you made mistakes and you'll do things a little differently next time, but also that you couldn't help it. It was beyond your ability to control.
And then you talk about this other character. So right now in my mind, I'm imagining this hospital and these operating rooms and this team of 32 doctors, I think you said, some of which are surgeons, and you're in charge of the chest wounds and the bleeding, patients, doctors everywhere. But there's this priest figure that comes in, Father Perez, with the holy water in one pocket and the tequila in the other. What was he doing there? How does a priest get to a hospital in the middle of Vietnam?
Well, they had clergy there, Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic. And Father Perez was Catholic, of course. And I'm not a Catholic, but he and I became really close. You're uptight when these soldiers come in. The helicopters land, and the Chinook double rotor helicopters could carry 20 casualties, and the smaller ones with just a single main rotor could carry 3 or 4. So you might have a Chinook land, and all of a sudden you have 20 casualties, and then 3 or 4 Hueys would come in with each one 3 or 4. And before long, you'd have 50 wounded patients in the A&D, which was the emergency room. And then you had to triage quickly, Some were dead. You put those over here. Some were really badly wounded. They went here. And the other people who walked off the helicopter, they sat on benches. And they all had this faraway look in their eyes, like they couldn't see what you were doing. They didn't recognize you. They were staring at a distance but sitting in a small room. And we would concentrate on the ones where speed was necessary. But Father Perez would be there, and he would concentrate on the same people. He would take down their names if they could talk. Some couldn't talk, but he would take their dog tags and write information down. And get their next of kin and talk to them if he could, say he'd help them write a letter after surgery and soothe their fears and so forth. Said you've got excellent doctors, we're going to take care of you, and blah, and so forth. And it was pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm. And he said something to you that really struck me is when you saw the boy who had lost, I think, a few limbs, and you said, let's not operate because it doesn't make a difference. And then Father Perez said, no, he's alive. He has a soul. I'm just wondering, having spent all that time in that intense environment with Father Perez, did you and him have conversations about what you were doing and kind of talk about the religious aspects of what you were doing?
Well, we disagreed that night. I mean, not vehemently, but I don't think I would have operated on that boy. That's probably one case I would have treated expectantly, because he was in an orphanage to start with. He didn't have parents. They'd been killed or left or something. And then he had lost both legs and one arm. And I left him with one arm and a stub extending from his shoulder and stubs for his legs. I couldn't imagine that in a war zone he would survive without extreme misery, and that he would eventually starve or become ill from some other reason and not get the treatment he needed. But Father Perez says he has a soul. Well, I had trouble discerning exactly what a soul is. I still don't really understand that part, but anyway, it occurred to me that it might be better not to operate on him. But Father Perez says he has a soul. We must try to save him.
What do you think it means? I mean, maybe you could share with us a bit about, you've been through so much.
I don't know. I think there are probably hundreds of interpretations of that. I saw so many deceased people, and they certainly looked deceased to me. I realize that doesn't mean they couldn't have had a soul that floated above them somewhere into eternity, but I guess I don't believe it as strongly as Father Perez did. Anyway, that night I did what he thought we should do, and the boy survived, which I really felt guilty about.
I'd love to talk a little bit about the transition from being in Vietnam to coming back home, because the environment you describe is so, I don't know, I imagine it as sort of like the outback of medicine, just adventurous and wild and fly by the seat of your pants, and you're, patching up holes and putting your fingers in heart valves, and it's just this incredibly intense time. And then what was it like to transition back to the States, or just in general, but also specifically as a physician and as a surgeon? Did kind of the normal medical practice feel boring to you, or were you happy to be away from that kind of intensity?
Well, I think, you don't see injuries like Vietnam anywhere in civilian practice except maybe with explosive problems. But I had a hard time adjusting when I came back. I'm sure my wife, Mimi, had problems, and I was looking for a job. I didn't have a job. I'd just gone over immediately after I finished, and I looked at academic jobs, and I had 2 kids, and a third one coming, and I didn't have any money, and I didn't want to go into a dog lab or a rat lab and do research, and I just thought, well, I'm going to go into private practice, and maybe the kids will become doctors and go into academics, which is what happened, actually. But anyway, I thought it was pretty dull. I thought there was a lot of the excitement was gone because we knew what we were going after. You didn't operate on anybody wondering what you'd find and thinking about the differential. You knew what you were going to find. You had angiograms, coronary angiograms, lots of other studies about cardiac function, beautiful x-rays of the lung and CAT scans. So it wasn't much guesswork. And I missed the guesswork. I missed the thinking on the feet part a lot. Something about that's addicting.
Yeah.
So I really like that.
Having been through what you've been through, how do you think about war in general, having gone through what you've been through?
I thought the Vietnam War, I think differently about different wars. I thought the Vietnam War was a political war run by politicians in Washington who didn't understand what was going on. And my mission was to save as many GIs as possible. So I didn't get involved. But on the other hand, I was very close to my father. He went into World War II when he was in his 40s as a surgeon, and he was with General Patton stopping the Nazis. And he fought in Bastogne, where the Germans lost all their equipment and bodies just littered the snow. That was a worthwhile war. I hate wars. But sometimes I don't know what the alternative would be. I don't understand how Hitler could have ever thought he could win. But he did have super weapons. He wasn't that far from the atomic weapon. That might have changed the war. Mm-hmm. So I was very thankful that that war was carried out successfully. And my father had a lot to do with that particular small part of the war.
Well, yeah, I'd love to hear you reflect a little bit about how you view human nature, because you have been around so much violence, both in the setting of Vietnam and, just being an American, and America has a lot of violence in its society. Yeah. How do you think about human beings and human nature and measured up to kind of the kindness and the spirit and the faith that is embodied by Father Perez with the serving you the little bit of tequila in the cap of the bottle? Where do you see us? Are we inherently violent and angry? Are we inherently loving and kind? Can both be true, or what do you think about that?
I think they're both true. It's sort of like asking a question about the soul. I don't have a good answer for that either, but I can tell you I've been in both situations of violence and love makes you feel a lot better, and it has a lot better long-term effect than violence. So I don't know. The other thing is, I just got back from Europe because I'm writing a book about my dad and my own experience in surgery, and I wanted to see where he was and where he went, like Normandy, the beach where they landed and where they went inland, and the flatlands to Paris, and then to Bastogne. We visited Bastogne, went to Berlin, and it's just amazing how friendly people are, and yet they were our dire enemies. And the same thing in Vietnamese. I mean, at VC, if he'd attacked, I would have killed him. But now he's my friend.
It seems like the half-life of the anger is pretty short. I actually went to Vietnam on vacation a couple of years ago, and they were very kind. And
they love America.
And they love America, which is, I guess
but I see also the other side. I work with Dr. Phuc. He escaped. He married a wonderful Vietnamese woman I met a few months before I left. And it turned out that she had some government connections, so did Dr. Phuc. The VC killed all their family, and they killed his wife. And Dr. Phuc escaped to America. He's in Houston now. He works as a surgeon. So...
Well, it's very complicated world that we live in, and human nature is complicated. And I just want to say thank you so much for your service. Wow. And I am just in awe of your courage and everything that you were able to accomplish, and also by your amazing memory and your ability to tell these stories and pass them down so that we don't forget. Thank you so much, Bill, for sharing this story that happened so many years ago. You can learn more about Bill on his website, williammeffert.com. It's in the show notes. And if you're interested in learning more about Vietnam, check out Bill's book recommendation, which is also in the show notes. Also, if you're interested in learning more about medical history in general, I want to give a shout out to an awesome medical podcast called Bedside Rounds. It's hosted by a doc named Adam Rodman, and there's a lot of great stuff to be found in his archives. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate us, review us, and share us with your friends. Spread the word. It really helps more people to find us. Also, we'd be so grateful if you'd consider making a donation to The Nocturnus. We work really hard to put this season together, and we can't sustain our work without your support. If you want to do this in a major way, we see you, we're searching for you, and we want you to reach out to us directly at thenocturnus@gmail.com. But don't worry, if you're a student or a trainee on a limited budget, even just a couple dollars a month can help us tremendously. Go to our Patreon website, that's Patreon, to set up your monthly donation. Lastly, check out our website to learn more about our storytelling contests. The theme is learning, and if your story is chosen, you'll get a $500 cash prize and a chance to be on Season 3 of the show. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Emily Silverman, host and creator of The Nocturnus. Special thanks to executive producer Allie Block, podcast producer Marina Poole, Program Coordinator and Head of Story Development, Adelaide Papazzolo, Sound Engineer, Alberto Hernandez, Assistant Producer, Kirk Clockey, our podcast intern, Chloe Lassard, Social Media Manager, B. Logan, our illustrator, Lindsay Mound, our composer, Yessie Monroe, and the voice of Boaz Monroe, and our fundraising lead, Cecilia Peterson. This episode's story was coached by Charlie Varon. And last but not least, thanks to our storyteller, Bill Meffert. We are the Nocturnists. See you later.